Tasha Williams stood at the front of the courtroom, her heart pounded, but her posture remained unshaken. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and yet no amount of preparation could have made her ready for the sentence that came her way. The judge's voice echoed in the quiet room as he delivered his ruling, his words harsh and firm, as though he were deciding the fate of someone who had caused him personal harm, not knowing that the woman standing before him was someone he had known for years. Tasha held her breath, not allowing the nervousness to show on her face. She had faced adversity before, but this was different. She knew something the judge did not. She knew that her sentence would not just affect her, it would ripple out to the entire community. Judge Mitchell sat high on his bench, looking down at Tasha as though she were just another defendant in a long list of cases he had handled that day. His gavel struck the surface with authority, and his eyes scanned the room without a second thought, as if everything were routine. But Tasha could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. Her hands clenched slightly at her sides. She was used to being underestimated. It was something that had been a constant in her life. But today it felt like an injustice far deeper than just her own case. Her eyes met his once more, only for a moment, as the judge continued reading the verdict. But there was no recognition in his gaze. He had no idea who she was outside of this courtroom, how she had dedicated her life to her church, how she had become the spiritual leader of a community that trusted and relied on her, how she had been a beacon of hope for so many who felt forgotten by society. It was a truth he could not know, a truth she had kept hidden for so long. Tasha had always kept her two worlds separate, the world of law and justice and the world of faith and compassion. They were worlds that often collided for people like her, but she had managed to navigate them with care and precision over the years. She had learned to hold her faith close without letting it interfere with her role in the wider community, her role as a pastor of Mount Zion Church, where she had led her congregation with love and wisdom, never asking for recognition or favor. But today it felt as though her worlds had collided in the most unexpected and painful way. As the judge finished his ruling, Tasha heard the murmurs in the room. She felt the weight of the eyes on her, but she held her head high. The court officers called her name and motioned for her to leave the dock, but Tasha did not flinch. She walked slowly out of the courtroom, her steps deliberate as the doors closed behind her, cutting off the noise of the outside world. Her mind was already racing. She had prepared herself for this possibility, but even now it felt like a strange and surreal moment in her life. Outside the courtroom, the world moved on. People walked by without giving her a second glance, but Tasha knew that this moment would change everything. She had hoped for justice, but it was clear that the path ahead would be anything but easy. She would have to fight not only for herself, but for a community that depended on her strength and leadership. But what she didn't know was that the man who had just sentenced her was a man she had seen every Sunday sitting quietly in the pews of her church. Tasha stood in the quiet of the courthouse hallway, her hand gripping the doorframe as she tried to steady herself. She had always known that the road ahead would not be easy, but nothing could have prepared her for the harshness of Judge Mitchell's ruling. The courtroom had felt cold and impersonal, yet for some reason the judgment stung deeper than she had expected. It was as though the very essence of her purpose had been disregarded, as if her entire life's work meant nothing. But Tasha was not a woman to be broken easily. She had learned long ago that strength did not come from avoiding hardship. It came from facing it head-on and rising above it. As she walked out of the courthouse, her mind wasn't focused on the ruling, but on the bigger picture. She had a responsibility to her community, a responsibility that extended far beyond any courtroom. The people who looked up to her needed her to stay strong, not just for herself, but for them. She had been leading Mount Zion Church for over 5 years, and in that time the church had grown from a small congregation to a thriving community of hundreds of people. Each Sunday, the pews were filled with faces of all ages, all races, all backgrounds, and it wasn't just her sermons that drew them in. It was her unwavering commitment to justice and compassion. Tasha had made it her mission to serve others, to stand up for the voiceless, and to help those who were often forgotten by society. Her work extended far beyond the walls of the church. As well, Tasha had founded multiple outreach programs aimed at empowering marginalized communities, providing food and shelter to the homeless, offering educational resources to underprivileged youth, and organizing peaceful protests against the systemic injustices that continued to plague their city. Her work had been a source of hope for many, but it had also made her a target for those who saw her as a threat. Yet, no matter how many obstacles she faced, Tasha had never once wavered in her commitment to her faith or her mission. It was this unwavering conviction that had allowed her to lead with such grace and strength. It was why people trusted her. They knew that her leadership was not based on power or ego, but on a genuine desire to help and uplift others. But today felt different. Today felt as if everything she had built was being questioned. It wasn't just the sentence that troubled her, it was the realization that Judge Mitchell, who had been a loyal member of her church for years, had just condemned her without even recognizing the connection between them. She had seen him every Sunday sitting in the back pew with his wife, listening intently to her sermons, but never once had he made the connection between the woman he respected and the woman he had just sentenced. Tasha's mind raced as she walked through the church doors, her heart heavy with the weight of the day. But as soon as she stepped inside, she was met with warmth. The familiar faces of her congregation greeted her with smiles and gentle words of encouragement. She could see the concern in their eyes, but they trusted her, they believed in her, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade away. She took a deep breath and walked to the pulpit where she stood every Sunday to deliver her message. It was a place where she felt connected to something greater than herself, a place where she could speak to the hearts of her congregation without fear or hesitation. Today, however, she wasn't sure how to begin, but as she looked out at the sea of faces before her, she knew one thing was certain: her purpose had not changed, her mission had not changed, and the fight for justice was far from over. Judge Mitchell sat alone in his chambers long after the court session had ended, his gavel still resting on the desk before him. The sound of the courtroom doors closing behind him seemed to linger in the air, a reminder of the decision he had made just hours ago. The courtroom was a place of order, a place where he had made countless rulings, often with little thought beyond the law. But today, something felt different. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, even though on the surface, his decision had seemed perfectly justified. He ran a hand over his tired face, his mind drifting back to the morning. Tasha Williams, the woman who had stood before him, had been calm, poised. There had been something almost regal about her as she faced him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet strength that left him unsettled. She hadn't argued, hadn't fought back, just accepted the sentence with the grace that only someone who had seen her fair share of injustice could possess. At the time, he had thought little of it. His job was simple, or so he had believed. The law was black and white, a series of rules that were meant to be followed without deviation. But something about Tasha had caught his attention, even though he couldn't quite place it. She had looked so familiar, yet he couldn't recall where he had seen her before. He had heard her name in passing, of course, but he never imagined it could have anything to do with the woman standing in front of them today. In the weeks that followed, Judge Mitchell began to feel an odd sense of discomfort that he couldn't explain. Every time he sat in his office, the image of Tasha Williams lingered in his mind. He found himself thinking about her words, her calm demeanor, and the strange sense of injustice that seemed to fill the room after he had sentenced her. He couldn't ignore it anymore. There was a disconnect between what he had done and the nagging feeling that something didn't add up. One Sunday morning, several weeks after the court hearing, he decided to attend church. It wasn't unusual for him to go. It had become part of his routine over the years. But this Sunday was different. He arrived early, slipping into the back pew as the congregation filled in around him. The church was buzzing with anticipation as the choir began to sing, the soft melodies reaching the highest rafters. It was a feeling he had come to cherish, the sense of peace that settled over him as the music enveloped the room. And then she stepped up to the pulpit. Tasha Williams, the woman he had sentenced so harshly, stood before him, her presence commanding the room. The sight hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. The calm, the strength, the grace, it was all her, and it was then that he recognized the connection that had eluded him for so long. Tasha, the woman who had delivered those powerful sermons every Sunday, was the same woman he had sentenced in his courtroom. The woman whose words had inspired him for so long who had helped him find clarity in his own personal struggles, was the very same person he had condemned without a second thought. A deep sense of shock washed over him. How could he have missed this? How could he have failed to recognize the very woman whose teachings had helped guide him through the hardest moments of his life? The truth settled in like a heavy stone in his chest. He had judged her not for who she was, but for the label society had placed on her. A black woman who spoke out against injustice, a woman whose voice carried weight, but whose life was so easily dismissed in the eyes of the law. He listened intently to her sermon, the words hitting him in a way they never had before. It wasn't just the message of hope and love that moved him. It was the realization that Tasha had been leading not just her congregation, but him as well. He had been following her guidance without even knowing it. The guilt he felt was overwhelming. How had he been so blind? How could he have condemned someone who had given so much to the community, to him personally, without even recognizing her full humanity? Judge Mitchell sat back in his pew, the sermon echoing in his mind. The image of Tasha's face, the calm, dignified woman who had faced the harshest judgment, remained with him long after the service ended. He knew that something needed to change, but he didn't yet know how. What he did know was that he had failed her, and in doing so, he had failed himself. The question that lingered in his mind was simple. Could he find redemption for his actions? And if so, where would he begin? Judge Mitchell couldn't stop thinking about the sermon that had pierced him like an arrow, each word hitting its mark with precision. The entire week after that Sunday, he was haunted by his actions, the unfairness of the sentence he had handed down, and the realization of just how much he had failed to see. Tasha Williams, the woman whose leadership he had admired from a distance, was the same woman he had condemned without hesitation in his courtroom. He had heard her words every Sunday, yet he had not made the connection between the compassionate leader of the congregation and the woman standing before him in the dock. How could he have been so blind? That Saturday, the day after the service, he found himself alone in his study, the weight of his conscience heavy upon him. The quiet stillness of the room was broken only by the rustling of papers on his desk and the distant sound of traffic. The more he thought about it, the more the guilt gnawed at him. He had spent years as a judge, making decisions that shaped lives, but now, for the first time, he wondered if his own judgments were clouded by the very biases he had worked so hard to deny. Sitting in his office, Judge Mitchell flipped through a legal case file, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered how Tasha had never raised her voice in the courtroom, never fought back with defiance or anger. She had simply accepted her sentence, not because she had no choice, but because she had a deeper understanding of what true strength meant. In that moment, Judge Mitchell realized that she was a woman of incredible fortitude, someone who had endured hardship without allowing it to define her. But the most powerful realization of all was that he had misjudged her, not because of the law, but because of his own preconceptions. He reflected on his years on the bench and the people he had judged, some guilty, some innocent. He prided himself on his impartiality, believing that his years of experience had given him the ability to see the truth in any case. But as Tasha's image filled his thoughts, he began to understand that there were deeper truths at play. His decision had not been based on the facts of the case. It had been influenced by an unconscious bias, a failure to see the humanity in Tasha, the woman who had been more than just a defendant. She had been a leader, a community pillar, someone who had worked tirelessly to improve the lives of others. Yet in his courtroom, she had been reduced to nothing more than a case number. The more Judge Mitchell thought about Tasha's work, the more he realized how important it had been to so many people, including him. She had guided him with her words, even though he had never shared with her the personal struggles he had faced. Her sermons had always resonated with him, but he had compartmentalized her message, separating it from his work. Now it felt impossible to deny the impact she had had on his life. Tasha had shaped the way he viewed the world, but he had never given her the credit she deserved, and now he had sentenced her unjustly. As the days passed, Judge Mitchell's guilt turned into action. He knew he had to do something, but what? He couldn't undo the harm he had caused with a simple apology. No, this was bigger than that. It wasn't just about acknowledging his mistake. It was about rectifying it in a way that would serve the greater good. He knew he had to meet Tasha, to hear from her directly and understand how his actions had affected her and her congregation. He had to face the woman he had wronged, the woman whose faith and strength had made her a beacon of hope for so many. But as he prepared to reach out, the reality of what he was about to do began to sink in. Would Tasha even agree to meet with him? Would she be willing to forgive him, or had he destroyed any chance of reconciliation? The questions weighed heavily on him, but there was one thing he knew for certain. He could no longer remain passive. He had to act, and he had to do it soon. So with a deep breath, Judge Mitchell made up his mind. He would reach out to Tasha, not as a judge, but as a man seeking redemption. He had made a mistake, but it wasn't too late to make things right. And for the first time in a long while, Judge Mitchell felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, a way to atone, to learn, and to heal. Judge Mitchell's heart raced as he composed the email to Tasha Williams. It felt strange to approach her, not as a judge, but as someone who had wronged her. He typed carefully, trying to find the right words to express his apology and his desire for a meeting. It wasn't easy. There was a part of him that feared rejection, that feared she might not want to face him, but he knew he had no choice but to try. After a moment of hesitation, he pressed send. The days that followed felt long and torturous. He went about his usual duties, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Tasha. Had she read his email? Would she respond? What would he say when they finally met? These questions lingered in his mind, distracting him from the work he had to do. It wasn't until late one evening, just as he was about to leave his office, that he received a response. He opened it eagerly, his fingers trembling slightly as he read her words. I received your message, Judge Mitchell. I think it's important that we speak. I will be at the church tomorrow at 3 p.m. I'll see you then. Tasha's response was brief, but there was a certain calmness to it that reassured him. She hadn't rejected him outright, and that gave him a small glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this meeting would change everything. The next afternoon, Judge Mitchell arrived at Mount Zion Church early. The church was a beautiful structure with tall, arched windows that let in soft streams of light. The building had always felt like a sanctuary to him, a place of peace and reflection. He had attended services here for years, but today felt different. His steps echoed in the empty hall as he waited for Tasha, unsure of what to say or how to begin. At exactly 3 p.m., the doors to the sanctuary opened, and Tasha walked in. She was dressed simply in a flowing black dress, her presence commanding yet serene. She moved toward him with a quiet confidence, her eyes locking with his as she approached. There was no anger in her gaze, but there was something else, something deeper. It was as if she were sizing him up, trying to understand the man who had sentenced her, who had misjudged her, and yet, here she was, standing before him. Judge Mitchell, she said softly, her voice steady but warm. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, he replied, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. I know that my actions, my decision, were wrong, and I'm here to offer my sincerest apologies. I failed you in a way I can't undo, but I want to make it right. I want to learn, and I want to do better. Tasha looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She had seen so many people come to her for forgiveness over the years, but this felt different. This man wasn't just seeking forgiveness. He was seeking understanding, and in that moment, she could sense his genuine remorse. You misjudged me, she said simply, her tone neither accusatory nor dismissive. But more than that, you misjudged the people I serve. The work I do is not just for myself. It's for the community, for the people who trust me, who depend on me. And when you sentenced me, you didn't just affect me, you affected them too. Judge Mitchell's throat tightened. He had known, of course, that his decision had far-reaching consequences, but hearing it from her, hearing the weight of it in her voice, hit him with a force he hadn't anticipated. I didn't see the whole picture, he admitted, looking down, ashamed. I saw you as a case, not as a person. I failed to recognize who you were, what you represented, and in doing that, I failed everyone you serve. Tasha nodded, as if she had expected this acknowledgement, but it didn't seem to give her any sense of satisfaction. She wasn't interested in just hearing him apologize. She wanted to know if he was truly ready to change, if he was willing to take action beyond words. "I believe in second chances," she said quietly, her voice firm. "But a second chance doesn't mean much if it's not followed by real change. If you want to make it right, Judge Mitchell, you need to start by listening. Not just to me, but to the people who are affected by your decisions. You need to be willing to challenge the biases that led you to judge me the way you did." Judge Mitchell was silent for a moment, taking in her words. It was clear that this wasn't just about a courtroom mistake. It was about a deeper commitment to equity, to justice that went beyond the surface. He knew she was right. A simple apology wouldn't fix what had been done. It was going to take more than that. But as he sat there, facing Tasha, he felt something within him shift. Maybe this wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. "I'm ready," he said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "I'm ready to listen, and I'm ready to change. Thank you for giving me this opportunity." Tasha's eyes softened, and for the first time, Judge Mitchell felt as though he was on the path to redemption. But the real work, he knew, was just beginning. The conversation between Judge Mitchell and Tasha Williams continued in the quiet, solemn space of Mount Zion Church, where the weight of his apology hung in the air. The church was almost empty now, save for a few scattered chairs and the sound of distant traffic filtering in through the tall, stained glass windows. The room felt sacred, as though every word spoken carried the potential for transformation. Judge Mitchell sat, his mind churning, as he listened to Tasha's words. She wasn't angry, but there was a firmness in her voice that commanded respect. "True change doesn't come with words alone," Tasha continued, her voice steady. "You've recognized your mistake, and that's the first step. But now it's about using your position to make sure the system you serve doesn't continue to hurt people like me and the community I represent. You need to be a voice for the voiceless, not just a figure who upholds the law without understanding the real-life consequences of those decisions." Judge Mitchell absorbed her words, his mind grappling with the enormity of what she was saying. He'd had spent years believing he was serving justice by following the letter of the law. He had prided himself on his impartiality, assuming that his role as a judge was to make decisions based solely on the evidence in front of him. But now, in the face of Tasha's quiet strength, he began to understand the limitations of that worldview. The law was not just about rules. It was about the people it affected, the lives it shaped, and the voices that often went unheard. "I've been blind," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was doing what was right, but I didn't see how my decisions impacted the people who trusted me. I've been so focused on the law that I forgot about the people the law is supposed to protect. You've opened my eyes to something I never realized." Tasha nodded, her expression softening as she listened to him. "I can't undo what's been done," she said quietly. "But you can start by making sure it doesn't happen again. You can use your platform to advocate for change. You can listen to the stories of those who come before you, understand their struggles, and recognize when the system is failing them." Judge Mitchell sat in silence, processing her words. The realization that his actions could perpetuate injustice had shaken him to the core. But in that moment, he knew Tasha was right. There was work to be done, both within himself and within the system he served. His role as a judge was not just to enforce the law, but to ensure that the law served all people equally, with compassion and fairness. Tasha stood up, her posture graceful but commanding. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," she said. "No one is. But I am asking you to be brave enough to confront the biases within you. And once you do, then you can use your power to be a force for change, not just in your court, but in the world." Judge Mitchell followed her lead and stood, the weight of the moment not lost on him. "I will," he said with conviction. "I'll do whatever it takes to learn, to grow, and to make sure my actions reflect the values of justice and fairness that I now understand more deeply." Tasha gave him a small but approving smile, and for the first time, Judge Mitchell felt as though he was on the path to redemption. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he had already taken the first step. He knew he had to work harder, not just as a judge, but as a man striving to be better. It wouldn't be easy, but he was committed to the journey. As he left the church that day, a new sense of purpose filled his chest. It wasn't just about making amends with Tasha, it was about changing the very foundation of the way he had viewed justice. He had seen the cracks in the system, and now he knew it was his responsibility to help repair them. The work ahead would be challenging, but he felt ready to face it, armed with the lessons he had learned from the woman he had once wrongly judged. Judge Mitchell's first action was to reach out to his colleagues, suggesting an open dialogue about the biases that could unknowingly influence their judgments. He knew that he couldn't do this alone. He had to foster a new understanding of justice, one that took into account the complexities of the world outside the courtroom. And as he made that call, he couldn't help but think back to Tasha's words, her quiet strength, her unwavering resolve. She had given him the tools to begin his transformation, and now it was up to him to use them. Judge Mitchell's resolve to change the way he viewed justice wasn't just about internal reflection. It wasn't enough to acknowledge his past mistakes. He knew he had to take tangible steps toward healing and reform. The weeks following his conversation with Tasha Williams were filled with moments of self-questioning, but also with small, yet significant actions. The most pressing issue was the realization that his personal transformation needed to be matched by real-world change within the judicial system itself. He began by reaching out to the members of his courthouse, starting with his fellow judges. He requested a series of informal meetings where they could discuss the implications of bias in the courtroom, how race and socioeconomic status often influenced verdicts and sentences, and how the law, for all its pretensions to objectivity, was still a human institution shaped by the values and prejudices of those who ran it. His colleagues were skeptical at first. They had always prided themselves on their impartiality, and the idea that their decisions could be influenced by unconscious bias was difficult to accept. But as the discussions deepened, more and more of them began to see the cracks in the system. There was a palpable shift in the courthouse as Judge Mitchell led the charge for this self-reflection. The conversations were uncomfortable at times, but they were necessary. For the first time, many judges began to examine their decisions not just through the lens of legal facts, but through the lens of empathy and equity. Slowly, they began to understand that the law was not always applied equally, that societal inequalities, which often played out in their courtrooms, couldn't be ignored simply because the law was supposed to be colorblind. Despite this progress, Judge Mitchell knew that his work in the courthouse was only a small part of a larger journey. Tasha had been right. He needed to engage with the community directly, to hear their voices and understand their struggles in a more personal way. That's when he began attending the church services at Mount Zion or regularly, sitting in the back pew, listening to Tasha's sermons, and gradually starting to build a relationship with the people who gathered there. He was no longer just a judge in the community. He was someone trying to learn, trying to understand the experiences that had been outside of his reach for so long. One Sunday after the service, Tasha invited him to join her for a community meeting in the church's fellowship hall. It was an open forum where members of the congregation could voice concerns, discuss challenges they were facing, and strategize about ways to advocate for change. Judge Mitchell felt a sense of nervousness as he walked into the room, the familiar feeling of being out of his depth creeping in. These were not legal discussions. They were discussions of life and survival, of systemic injustice and community solidarity. He sat quietly at first, listening to the conversations that unfolded. A young man spoke of being wrongfully stopped by police while walking home from work. A mother shared the story of how her son, a high school student, had been disproportionately punished for minor infractions at school simply because of his race. One by one, the stories piled up, each one a testament to the fact that the system was failing the very people it was meant to protect. When it was Judge Mitchell's turn to speak, he felt the weight of every word. "I've spent my career in the courts, deciding the fates of people who've come before me," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I've realized that I've been looking at it all wrong. I've been making decisions based on a law, yes, but not on the humanity of the people behind the cases. And for that, I am truly sorry. I promise you all that I'm going to do better. I will listen to your stories. I will work to change the system that has failed you." The room was silent for a moment, and then slowly, one by one, people nodded, some even smiling. They could see that this wasn't just a politician's empty words. This was a man who had recognized his mistakes, who had come to them, not as a judge, but as a person who had been humbled by the experiences of others. Tasha, who had been standing quietly at the front, walked toward him. She gave him a look of approval, the same serene but powerful gaze that had first unsettled him in the courtroom. "I believe you, Judge Mitchell," she said, "but words are just the beginning. It's what you do with those words that will show the true depth of your commitment to change." It was a sobering reminder, but one that Judge Mitchell needed. He knew he had taken the first step, but it was only the beginning. He would continue to meet with the community, continue to work with his colleagues in the courthouse, and most importantly, he would continue to fight for a more just and equitable system. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with setbacks and challenges. But with each step, he felt more resolute, more determined to right the wrongs he had once perpetuated. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that redemption was within reach. Months passed, and the changes Judge Mitchell had set in motion began to take root. The conversations he had initiated in the courthouse about bias and equity grew in frequency and depth. What had started as informal meetings among a few colleagues evolved into a full-scale initiative to reform the way they approached cases, especially those involving marginalized communities. Judge Mitchell spearheaded training sessions for all the judges and court staff, focusing on recognizing and confronting unconscious bias, the historical disparities in the justice system, and the importance of cultural competency. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and slowly, a culture of self-reflection began to take hold in the courthouse. Judge Mitchell's efforts to understand the community had also paid off. He continued attending services at Mount Zion Church and participating in the church's outreach programs. He spent hours speaking to local leaders, listening to their struggles, and finding ways that the judicial system could better serve the community. The church, with Tasha Williams at its helm, had become a beacon of hope for many, and through his ongoing involvement, Judge Mitchell saw firsthand the incredible impact of Tasha's leadership. It was on one of those visits that he was invited to participate in a community event designed to bring together local leaders, law enforcement, and citizens. The event was called Building Bridges, and its purpose was to foster dialogue between those who had been historically divided by systemic injustice. Judge Mitchell was hesitant at first, unsure of what role he could play, but Tasha encouraged him, reminding him that his position could be a catalyst for greater change. On the day of the event, the atmosphere was tense, with people from all walks of life gathered in a large hall. There were activists, police officers, teachers, community organizers, and concerned citizens. The air was thick with expectation, and Judge Mitchell felt the weight of the responsibility he carried as he took the stage. Tasha introduced him, and as he stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He could feel the eyes of the audience on him, waiting for him to speak. For a moment, he hesitated, uncertain of how to begin. But then, the words he had practiced in his mind came flooding out. "I stand before you today not as a judge, but as someone who has learned how flawed our system can be. I've seen the pain caused by decisions that were made without understanding, without compassion. I've been a part of that system, and I've contributed to its injustices. But I am committed to changing that. I can't undo what's been done, but I can work every day to ensure that I do better, that we all do better." The crowd listened intently as Judge Mitchell shared his journey, from the moment he had first realized his mistakes to the steps he was taking to rectify them. He spoke about the changes within the courthouse, the training sessions, the ongoing conversations, and his personal commitment to challenging the biases that had once shaped his judgments. He acknowledged the harm the system had caused, but emphasized the importance of collective effort in moving toward a more just future. When he finished, there was a pause, and then, unexpectedly, a round of applause. Judge Mitchell felt a lump form in his throat as he realized the significance of that moment. It wasn't just about his redemption. It was about the hope that others, too, could change, that the system could evolve, that progress was possible. As the event continued, he watched as people from different backgrounds engaged in difficult conversations. There were moments of tension, but also moments of understanding. The dialogue was raw, sometimes uncomfortable, but always productive. And at the end of the day, Judge Mitchell knew that the seeds of change had been planted. Back at Mount Zion, Tasha Williams stood at the back of the room, watching the scene unfold. Her quiet strength was evident as she observed the new alliances forming, the willingness of people to listen and understand one another. She caught Judge Mitchell's eye from across the room and gave him a small, approving nod. He had come a long way from the judge who had sentenced her, and she was proud of the man he was becoming. Judge Mitchell's journey had not been easy, but as he left the event that evening, he felt a sense of peace he had not known before. The road to redemption was not a straight path. It was filled with setbacks and challenges, but it was also filled with moments of growth, of learning, of reaching out, and of healing. He had found a new sense of purpose not just in his work, but in his life. The impact of his transformation was just beginning to be felt, but Judge Mitchell knew that his legacy would no longer be defined by the mistakes of his past. He was determined to ensure that the justice system he served would be one of fairness, empathy, and understanding, one that truly upheld the values of equality and justice for all. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in his career, Judge Mitchell felt he was finally walking it in the right direction.